Welcome to the Career Success Secrets podcast. I am your host, Mike Tomasello. I'm starting off the podcast with a little behind the scenes goofiness. I hope you enjoy the fact that I am bringing slightly different energy to this week's episode. Before we jump into today's topic, and today's topic is something that I don't think is talked about on career podcasts enough, and that is interviewing, and particularly interviewing strategy and how to think about it. And so we're going to have a really fantastic episode for you on interviewing today. Before we get into that, I do want to do a quick shout out to the number 2 country where we have the most listeners outside of the United States. The number 2 country, much to my surprise, is France. So welcome, France. Super appreciate you listening in. And I want to remind everybody, although we do primarily look at this from a North American lens, and when I say North American, I am predominantly talking about the United States and Canada. I have been told all over the world, probably in, I'd estimate, around 43 countries around the world, that these tips do tend to work elsewhere. There is a special disclaimer for this episode in that cultural norms in terms of communication and how one speaks and how brief they are, how quickly they get to the point, that will vary from country to country. So you will be noticing in this episode that we talk about the importance of getting to the point and selling yourself properly. And if you are from an African culture or you are from an Asian culture, and to some extent, some parts of Latin America, some parts of the Middle East, you will find that there are exceptions to some of the things that I'm going to share with you today. So please validate this information in your local market. However, if you are in Western Europe, North America, these tips are going to be pretty good for you right off the bat. So that's what I wanted to say. Also, I want to remind you, thank you so much for supporting the show. The Career Success Secret Show is still rather new, and we can't do it without every single one of you. So quick ask, if you have listened to an episode before, either before the episode gets started or at the end of the episode, please do me the favor of subscribing to the show. If you're on a platform like Apple Podcasts where you can rate the show, you can literally rate the show in, I think, 1 or 2 clicks. Give it a 5-star rating if you so choose. And then if you have a little bit of extra time, you can either comment or you can review. Reviews don't have to be super complicated. Reviews can be, I liked it. Reviews can be, I loved hearing about interviewing. I loved listening to Mike interview some of the guests who are hiring managers and recruiters. It can be a very, very simple review. It's totally up to you. And that goes a long way towards us being found by new listeners on the different platforms. Subscribe, rate, review. And then if you're listening to this on something like YouTube, then comment and like the video as well. Very much appreciated. So today we are going to be talking about interviewing. I'm not going to call this interviewing 101 because I think even if you've taken a course on interviewing before, even if you've read a lot of articles about interviewing before, I think we're going to present the information to you in a way where it's actually kind of different from what you might be used to listening to. I think you're going to find it valuable. Some of you are more advanced interviewers than others, so it's totally normal if you've heard some of this stuff before. But as you listen to the information and as you consider taking notes, I want you to think to yourself, have I actually implemented this? Have I actually implemented this? And then if you have implemented this, I want you to go a step deeper and say, how can I do this even better? How can I do this even better than the way that I'm already doing it? I think you will find if you ask yourself, how can I do this even better? That you will eventually find ways where your interviewing can dramatically improve, even if you think you know everything that there is to know about interviewing. Before we jump into the content, I want you to know it's okay if things aren't perfect. I want you to know that it's okay if you don't improve on all of these things at once. At the end of the day, if you have an interview that's starting tomorrow or you have an interview that's starting in the next hour, turn this off and focus on just being in good spirits for your interview, or focus on the interview answers that you've already come up with, or focus on reviewing your resume so that you're familiar with what's on it. Don't try to cram in new interview techniques or try to get better at the last minute, because I would rather you be feeling great. I would rather that you're not overthinking things going into your interview, and you're potentially going to do really good. So you don't have to be a master of everything to get hired. However, there are a lot of things you can potentially master that will increase the likelihood that you get hired. And that's the other thing that I wanted to say about mastery, particularly interview mastery, is a lot of times people will say, well, I'm doing that, or I'm kind of already doing that. And my challenge to you is, have you mastered it? If you haven't mastered it yet, and you're not yet hired, and you're trying to get a job offer, or you're trying to get multiple job offers, then maybe you work on improving your interviewing every single week, even in the weeks when you don't have interviews scheduled. Because sometimes an interview will come out of the blue and you don't necessarily have a ton of time to prepare. And so I don't want you to send your anxiety through the roof because you're trying to do things last minute. So, but luckily you're listening. And so we're going to jump right into it. The first thing that I want to jump into is that almost all interviewees, and if you are interviewing for a job, you are an interviewee, almost all interviewees make these two mistakes. And I work with some really high level people in my coaching practice. I've worked with people all the way up to C-level people, CXOs, chief marketing officers, CEOs, all the way up to CXOs of the Fortune 1000 level. Now, here's the good news. You don't have to be at that level to gain something out of this. A lot of these concepts are simple enough for anyone to understand. But I want to let you know, even if you think you're super qualified, and you probably are, because otherwise you wouldn't have gotten the interview, you can be super qualified and you can be great in your career, but interviewing is a different skill. Interviewing is a different skill than the stuff that you do for your job on a day-to-day basis. Totally normal to be great at your job, but to be average or below average at interviewing. Number one mistake, probably not too much of a shocker, but you are probably underselling yourself. You are probably underselling yourself. This is the most important one to fix. I'd argue they're both extremely important to fix, but this is the most important one to fix, because if you can't articulate why they should hire you, if you can't articulate why you're a great fit for the role, they're probably, potentially, but probably not going to figure it out on their own. They're not. They're not going to figure it out on their own. You need to say, these are the reasons why you should hire me. These are why I'm great at XYZ job title. These are the particular skills. These are the particular job duties that I'm amazing at. This is the business impact that I've made for other organizations and that I can probably make for you because I've done it at multiple organizations. The more that you can do as much of that as possible, the better off that you're going to be. Specifically relevant to the job, which we'll come back to later in the show. The other one that most people don't think about, and I would argue even recruiters screw up, and I love my recruiters out there, but until you're looking at it from a job searcher who has been struggling for 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, until you look at it from the person that's struggling and not the ideal candidate's point of view, sometimes they have a tendency to just look at things from that amazing superstar candidate. And so they don't necessarily understand some of the mistakes that some of the other people are making. They see a lot of the mistakes, just they might forget to coach around some of them. And that's talking too much about the reasons not to get hired. Now, the thing that I will say about that is you probably don't even realize you're doing it. If you are having really long answers to questions that aren't important, then you're doing it. If you are giving them if you're giving them a really long answer to why you left your last job, you're probably making that mistake. If you're giving them a long answer to your commute time or where you live, very likely making that mistake. So we will talk about what some of that looks like today. I think you're going to find that super, super interesting. All right, let me go back to my notes. So interview questions. I am purposely oversimplifying things. So if you're a recruiter, I love you. If you're an advanced interviewer, I love you. And if you hear me say something, just be patient with me before you overly judge. All the advice that I'm giving you, and I'd say all the advice that you ever hear from anyone on any podcast, on any YouTube channel, on any one meeting that you're having with your mentor, there's almost always exceptions to when the advice is relevant. Now, I try to only teach things that are relevant the vast majority of the time, but there can be exceptions. As a disclaimer, I gave at the beginning of the show, there's an exception for people that are living in different countries, and how you communicate, the length that you communicate your interview answers and stuff like that. That's an exception to some of the stuff that I'm sharing today. Am I saying that there are some interview questions that are always going to hurt you? No, not exactly. But I am trying to simplify things for you so that you can more easily pick out those things that are potentially hurting you. So let's break this down a little bit. Interview questions that can help you. Those should be the easier ones for you to figure out. Anything that allows you to talk about why you would be a great fit for the job. Those are the questions that are going to help you the most. Those are going to be the questions that determine whether you get the job. Those are going to be the questions that determine whether you're better than other people that are applying. So if they're asking you about a certain skill in the job description, that is an opportunity, even if you're not amazing at the skill, to sell what you do know about how to do that. That's an opportunity for you to sell the results that you have gotten working with that. That's your opportunity to sell your knowledge of what you do know how to do about that, even if you're not an expert in it. And by the way, I know we're talking about ways to sell yourself, but if you are frequently saying, I'm not an expert, or I'm not great at that, or I only have a little bit of experience on that, although you're being honest, you're also oversharing and you're putting qualifiers on the great experience that you do have, and it's turning into you underselling yourself. It is not your responsibility to judge your answers. It is not your responsibility to judge whether or not you have experience or not. It is your responsibility to sell the experience, impact, results, and knowledge that you do have. And then the interviewer, the hiring manager or the recruiter, it's their responsibility to decide if that's enough for them or whether they prefer someone who has more experience or whatnot. You might be surprised. They might think you have the perfect amount, or they might love the fact that you articulate your knowledge in such a way that they actually like you better than the person who's technically done it a lot longer, because you seem really knowledgeable about how it's done. You've done your research, or you've talked to a great number of people in your field. Don't think that you have to be the most experienced, and if you're not the most experienced, that you can't land the job. You absolutely can. I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent, but this is a trap that a lot of older, more experienced workers fall into. Although ageism does exist, I find a lot of people that are older and more experienced, and I arguably fall into that demographic. A lot of my friends fall into that demographic. They tend to think, oh, they should be able to see that I have 20 years of experience or 15 years of experience, but they don't articulate why they're great at any of those duties. They don't communicate well the impact, the numbers, the metrics, the achievements that they've had. And so it comes off as them underselling themselves, and that's often something that's holding them back, is they simply didn't do a good job of proving that they would be better at the job. They just assumed people would give them the benefit of the doubt because they have that level of experience. Interview questions that can hurt you. So I talked about this a little bit, but let me talk about it a little bit more. Even though there are some questions that aren't going to hurt you, the reason why I say there's no neutral is you have a limited amount of time in the interview. If you only have an hour with that person, or you only have 45 minutes, or you only have 30 minutes, very common, not just with recruiter screens, but sometimes hiring managers as well. If you only have 30 minutes, that's not a lot of time for someone to get to know you. It's not a lot of time for you to talk about all the reasons why you're a great fit for the role. So if you are spending extra time on questions that don't really matter, that aren't going to help convince them to choose you, then that's a mismanagement of your time. And because of that, it's hurting you. We're gonna get into detail in terms of how to handle that stuff more, but I wanted to give you the basic overview in terms of what's going on there. Let's go to the next item on the agenda. So for the next couple of things I'm going to share with you, the next couple of things are going to be focused on selling yourself and maximizing selling yourself. And I know selling for some of you is like kind of a dirty word. And I promise you, I mean selling yourself without being salesy. I mean marketing yourself, proving that you're valuable, talking in a communicative way that's enjoyable, where you're building rapport with someone, but you are also making an argument about why they should hire you, and why they should hire you probably over the 10 other people that they're potentially interviewing, or 15, or the 200 or 2,000 people that might have applied. This is why it's so worthwhile to go back and think about your interview answers, look at your interview answers and say, how could I do this even better? Because it might sound okay coming out of your mouth. It might look kind of good, but if you don't double check that and say, in comparison to what 10 other people might be saying, you might be leaving out something pretty good because you were taught to be humble growing up. And hey, yours truly, I was taught to be humble growing up. And so this was a habit that I needed to break, in particular for my interviews. So, long story short, for those of you watching the YouTube video, I have a slide up that I haven't been talking about yet. And so, one of my tips to help you sell yourself better is to always assume every question is in relation to the job. Always assume that every question is in relation to the job, the specific job. So, let me tell you how this can be useful for you. So, probably the number one question, which people hate, but unfortunately, it's also the number one question that's often asked by interviewers, is tell me about yourself. And that's it. So it's not your fault that it's confusing. Well, what do they want to know? Do they want to know about where I grew up? Do they want to know about such and such? And so if in your head or on paper, because hopefully you're preparing ahead of time, if you think to yourself, this question is in relation to the specific job title and job description I'm applying to, and the specific company and company type and industry I'm applying to, then that will help you come up with a better answer on the spot. Tell me about yourself in relation to a marketing manager position in tech. Much different question and much different answer than just tell me about yourself. How would you describe your personality? Wait a minute. They mean, how would you describe your personality in relation to being a software developer on the front end who works with React? Okay. So this is a question, especially for questions that you know you're going to get asked or that are really common questions. It's good to think about. But also in the interview, sometimes you're asked a question that you've never been asked before. Take a step back or pause if you're unsure and say, in relation to the job, how long's your commute time? Huh. How long's my commute time in relation to the job? Maybe they're asking about my commute time because they're worried my commute time might be too long and I'm going to come into work late or have to leave early or whatnot. So my strategy is to make my commute time a non-issue and not go into detail or not talk long about it if I don't have a really short commute time. Same thing for location in the metropolitan area. So this can literally work for any question. It's going to help you decide how you're going to answer it more effectively. In parentheses, in relation to the specific job that I'm hiring for. So that's so key. All righty, let's go to the next one. All right, maximize the positive. So fairly simple concept. So maximize the positive, and this goes back to, hey, are you selling yourself properly? Also, it reminds you, hey, I should probably be more positive in general. If I come in and I've had a rough day, and we all have rough days, we all get burnt out. Sometimes we get in car accidents, sometimes we get sick. But if we come in and we look like we don't want to be there, if we come in and we don't look excited about potentially working for them, then that's something that potentially makes sense for them to go with someone else. So maximize the positive has multiple meanings there. The next thing I want to say that's going to help you increase the likelihood that you don't undersell yourself is, if what we're talking about is positive, if what we're talking about is an opportunity to sell yourself, I want to encourage you to talk in threes. Not in fives, not in sevens, not as many things as you can potentially think of. Because if you actually overshare and you have too many components to your answer, that they can actually get overwhelmed with too much information. And studies have actually shown, there's been some studies done out of Princeton University that show the average human being can only keep track of about 5 to 7 things in their head at one time. So how do you apply this talking in three strategy? Tell me about yourself. Tell me 3 reasons why I should hire you. Tell me 3 reasons, or tell me 3 reasons why you would be great at the job. Or tell me 3 things related to your candidacy. If they ask you the question, what do you do best? It might sound like, oh, best, man, what's the one thing I do best? But they didn't say what's the one thing you did best. They said, what do you do best? So why not give them 3 answers to what you do best? Because if they don't like one of them, or one of them is too fluffy or too much of a soft skill and they were looking for hard skills, then you giving them 3 significantly different answers to what you do best, that's going to increase the likelihood that at least 1 or 2 resonates with them. Or that's going to increase the likelihood that you said something that no one else said. Because sometimes they discount some things if all of the candidates talked about it. So it's not that you have to be the most unique person, but you do want to have a diversity of responses. So talking in threes will help you with that considerably. If you're summarizing, hey, thank you for bringing me into the interview today. Before I ask my final questions of you, I just want to say I think I'd be a great fit for X, Y, and Z reason. Summarize your candidacy in threes. So you can do this for literally any question. If they're asking you about, for a developer, if they're asking you about a certain coding situation, give them 3 ways you might tackle it, or give them 3 different coding skills that you have. If you're a marketing manager, talk about 3 different aspects of marketing that you're good at, because there's tons of different ways and different responsibilities in most people's jobs. I think that will help you considerably. And let's go to the next one on the list. This will help a lot of you. This one is particularly for those of you listening who are in United States, Canada, and Western Europe especially. You know your culture better than I do for this one. To prevent rambling, to prevent oversharing, to prevent overloading their brain with too much information or zoning out, I'm going to suggest that whenever you're selling yourself positively for a question, that you maximize it by talking for at least a minute. That you maximize it by talking for at least a minute. If you're talking significantly less than a minute, like if it's below 45 seconds, man, there's more stuff that you could be saying if they're asking you a question about why you think you would be great for the job. And except for a few exceptions, you want to keep the majority of your answers to about a minute and a half. Now, sometimes some of you will have a very conversational style. Some of you are better storytellers than the others. If you're really good at telling stories, you could check in with them and say, hey, there's a great story that I'd love to tell you about that. Is that okay? And they'll probably be okay with it, but it allows them to take a step back and say, well, wait a minute, I had a sub question that I wanted to ask you, or I wanted to ask you about some of that context you just shared with me. But if your answers are too long, especially if you don't pause very often, or you have a tendency to talk really fast, which a lot of you do when you're nervous, then you might not be giving them an opportunity to say, hey, John, hey, Jane, I really loved what you said about X. Can we talk more about that? You structuring your answers so that you're not sharing too much at one time. And if you want to share more, you can always pause and say, hey, there's more that I'd like to share with you, but let me pause there and see if you have any questions yet. No, you don't have any questions. In that case, I'm going to share 1 minute more or 90 seconds more. People do have short attention spans. Not to say that just because the average North American attention span is 8 seconds, that doesn't mean that your answers should be that short. That just means, again, in North America, in Western Europe, get to the most important part, or get to the part that's going to interest them or wow them quicker. And throughout your share, make sure you're only covering things that are going to wow them or going to interest them or whatever, because otherwise they're going to zone out and they're going to forget half of what you said. All right, let's talk about minimizing the negative. Minimizing the negative is you don't want to talk for a full minute. You don't want to talk for a minute and a half. Let me give you some examples of negative. So 1, negative attitude, negative vibe. Did you struggle to get there in traffic? Did you have a whole bunch of hiccups in trying to join the virtual meeting? All of that stuff isn't necessarily positive and isn't going to convince them to hire you. And so you're better off not addressing it, or if it does have to be talked about, being very brief, addressing it and moving on quickly, so that you can move on to the positive stuff and the reasons why to hire you. The other part of minimizing the negative is those different types of questions, the questions that can potentially hurt you that we talked about earlier. So, what's your commute time? Are you willing to travel? Are you willing to travel 70% of the time? Are you willing to come into the office 5 days a week, 3 days a week, or whatever? Now, the good news is, especially if you can answer confidently yes, you can say enthusiastically yes, or yeah, I'm happy to. And that's enough, and you can move on. In many cases, some of these questions are just them checking a box to make sure you meet the basic requirements. They don't necessarily require long answers. If they're asking you a question about your weaknesses, although we love people that are self-aware, weaknesses are not going to be the reason why you get hired. Weaknesses are potentially, if you have the wrong ones, are potentially going to be the reasons why not to get hired. So why do you have this 1 minute, 2 minute, 3 minute long answer for your weaknesses when you really should be getting out of there in a sentence or two? Address what the weakness is, quickly move on. They might ask you a follow-up question, give another brief answer, and move on. Just because they ask about it doesn't mean that you need to give long answers to it. Another popular answer that sometimes people way overshare on is, why did you leave your last company? Or why are you currently looking? Or what have you been up to over the past year? Your goal is to address the concern as quickly and succinctly as possible and move on to talk about things. The more that you overshare, especially if you haven't properly thought it out, especially if you haven't prepared that statement ahead of time, the more likely that you're accidentally going to say something that's misinterpreted or misjudged as a potential warning flag. Not to say that layoffs don't occur all the time, not to say that terminations don't occur all the time. They do. But spending extra time talking about it, if you're not careful, can have you coming off as negative, can have you coming off as not having dealt with it. It can be overanalyzed and be like, well, wait a minute, you were in a marketing position or you were in a sales position. If you marketed better or you sold better, maybe the company wouldn't have had to lay as many people off, especially if you're at the executive level. Keep things to the basics and focus on the positive as much as possible. Hey, I saw this as a great opportunity to find something even better. I found this as a great opportunity to find a product portfolio that I'm even more excited about. I found this as a great opportunity to find a culture that's an even better fit for me. And from what I've heard about yours, I think that's likely you. So these, even though in general, I'm telling you, hey, minimize the negative for questions that can hurt you, maximize the positive for the ones that can help you. Also, sometimes both tips can apply to both questions. How can you cut out stuff that is potentially misinterpreted as negative? How can you incorporate positivity into different questions so that things aren't necessarily held against you? So there's a lot of different ways to do it. Let's go on to another strategy. So pretty simple strategy. If you think it creates doubt, leave it out. And for some of you that are getting used to this concept, this is continuing the minimize the negative theme. If you think it might create doubt, it probably does. Leave it out, or if you can't leave it out, be as brief as possible and move on. Because if it doesn't clearly help, then it potentially hurts. Even because some people are going to come for me in the comments, even if it means spending less time on an unimportant question so that you can move on to a more important question. If that's the only way that it helps you, that's a really important way that it helps you. All right. So continuing on the train of minimizing the negative, if a question can't help you, don't give multiple responses to it unless you're forced to. So probably the easiest one is, what are your weaknesses? Well, even though they said plural, a lot of times you can get away with giving just one thing. So give just one thing, preferably something that's not directly related to the type of work you're doing, and move on. They might ask you a follow-up question. Nothing bad about that. Keep your answer brief. But the vast majority of the time that my clients and other people that I speak to, the vast majority of the time, even for the weaknesses question where they're implying a plural, a lot of times they don't even notice and they don't ask you for a second or a third. Unless they force you to think of something, I would just give them one and move on quickly. This could literally be any question that you think could potentially be held against you, or any question that isn't going to help you get the job. Again, questions that can help you get the job, questions that can potentially hurt you. The strategy is to be as brief as possible. Be as brief as possible. If a question won't win you the job, it can cost you the job. The more information you give, the more it can be misinterpreted, or the more it can be judged. Really, really want you to get that. Not all of your answers need to be long, and focus on giving longer answers to the questions and the things that are really going to wow them and impress them and have them visualizing you as being in the job. One of the things as I start to wrap up, if you like this episode, please subscribe for a new show like this. It helps us tremendously to potentially be shown on the news and noteworthy lists and be seen by other people, because this podcast is all about helping as many people as possible. Also, if you've already done that, please think of a friend or a family member or a coworker or an ex-coworker that might benefit from the podcast, and send them the link. Tell them to check it out. Tell them why you think they might benefit from the podcast. If we can grow the show by one person introductions, I am all for that. You'd be shocked how much you can grow things through a one-on-one approach. I'm just asking you to potentially introduce this to one person. So one of the last concepts that I am going to start to wrap up on is be careful about getting too cocky. Now, if you're listening to this, you're probably not very cocky, so keep listening. You might be cocky and not even realize it. So the tip I want to share is, no matter how great you think the interview is going, you do not have a job offer until they say, we would like you to offer you the job. And I'm going to take it a step further. We would like to offer you the job, and we're in the process of putting an offer together for you. Or, we would like to offer you the job, and this is the salary that we're thinking about offering you for the job. So until they start to get specific, no matter how well it's going, no matter how much they're smiling, no matter how much they love you or tell you that you're the top candidate or the final candidate, you don't have the job yet. And I don't say that to discourage you. I say that so that you have the right mindset, because a bunch of mistakes tend to happen when you think that you're the number one candidate. Well, one, a lot of people stop talking about all the reasons why they should get hired, even though the interview isn't over yet, or even though there's more people to interview yet. And then they don't go into those new future interviews as focused or as prepared or selling and articulating their value proposition as well. So you do not have a job offer until they say that you do. The other reason why I bring up this point is, just because they're smiling a lot doesn't mean you're their person yet. They might be purposely trying to smile. Every interviewer has a different style, but they might purposely be trying to make you feel more comfortable, and they're smiling a lot and they're encouraging you simply so that they can bring out your best. But secretly, they've decided that they have someone else they like more than you already. But they're still trying to be open-minded. They're still trying to encourage you because they know interviews are hard. And they know interviews aren't easy. Another is, they might simply be a friendly person. And again, they want to communicate they have a great team culture, or they want to communicate that they have a great company culture. And so therefore, they want to smile and encourage even those people that aren't necessarily going to get the job. So I think you guys get it. The other thing, and I've personally made this mistake, is a lot of times that they will use that as a technique to find out as much about your salary requirements as possible. Now, This entire podcast is not about salary negotiation, because that would take more than an entire episode to cover adequately. And I know some recruiters, especially headhunters, especially third-party recruiters, external recruiters, agency recruiters, a lot of them will tell you it's to your advantage to reveal your number in the beginning. And in some cases, they're right. In some cases, they're not right. If you get interviews really, really easily, then you can do whatever you want, and it might actually save you some time to reveal your number early on in the process, especially if you are very high in your metropolitan area in comparison to what other people are being paid. If you don't know if you're in that upper bracket or not, or you're unemployed, especially if you've been unemployed for a while, or you're not sure how good of an interviewer you are yet, if you want to maximize the number of job offers you get, my recommendation is you spend the entire allotted time talking about why you're a great candidate, and how much you charge, how much you want to get paid is not explaining why you're a good candidate. Many people that have heard me speak before know that I'm a big advocate for confirming their salary range if you're in California or a state or a country where it is mandated by law that they provide a range. Confirm that you're within the range. A lot of people will move on as long as they understand that. Getting them to reveal their preference or what they're thinking is going to put you in a better position when things do come to an offer or do come to a negotiation, and they're going to be less likely to misinterpret you coming back and negotiating as, oh, he or she said they would accept XYZ. They said that early in the process, and now they're changing their minds. That can rattle a few cages. So getting them to talk about their numbers and you simply confirming that they're close is going to save you a lot of headaches. And that's why I say you do not have a job offer until they say, we would like to offer you the job, and here's what we're offering you. They have power, you have power. But don't go anywhere. I'm going to take it in a different direction than some of the interview advice that you've gotten in the past. Some of you have been getting advice that you're also interviewing them. And that's true, but I'm not sure for those of you that are not amazing at getting job offers, for those of you that don't get multiple job offers easily, I think that's a potential trap that you can fall into. Because again, everything that's coming out of your mouth, even if it seems like an insignificant question, it's either helping you or it's hurting you. And so I think you want to be careful about what you say and what you share with them as you're evaluating whether or not it's a good fit. If you're unsure whether you want the job yet or not, that's okay. Do I want you to figure that out before you accept? Abso-friggin-lutely. Abso-friggin-lutely. I want you to ideally get a culture that's a great fit for you. I want you to get the money and the payment that you want. I want you to have a boss that you love, coworkers that you love. Hopefully, you are at a point, or you are working your way up to a point where you can have that in your career. And my suggestion, which is counter to what you might have heard from some hiring managers and some recruiters, is even though you are also interviewing them, does not mean, this is arguably the most important part of the whole show, that does not mean that it's in your best interest to say whatever you want, or that does not mean it's in your best interest to ask them whatever you want. Eventually, before you accept, I want you to ask anything that you want. But let's be real. Let's be honest. They have more power than you do. Even if you are one of the best in the world at what you do and you have options, now that's a great situation to be in. But if you really, really want the job, if you really, really want the job offer, they have more power than you because they're interviewing 5 other people or they're interviewing 10 other people. And if they decide for whatever reason they don't like all of those 5, they have 200 other applicants they can go and they can look at and they can interview. So let's be honest, they have more power than you do. Now, here's the cool news. Once they have decided that you are the number one candidate for the role, once they've decided that you are the person that they want to hire, you are their top choice. Now, all of the power, or 98% of the power, now it shifts to you because now they know you're the best of the best or the best of what's available. And now they're, potentially worried about losing you. So now it's safe after you get the job offer to ask those difficult questions. And the cool thing is you probably bought yourself a little bit of time, increased the likelihood that you got a second or a third job offer in the meantime. And now you can come back and you have leverage, and you only have leverage if you are willing to walk away. You only have leverage if you have more than one option. And so now you have leverage to ask the difficult questions because they're like, man, I want to make sure he or she is happy. I want to make sure they're happy. And so let me tell them about all of the great things about our culture. Let me tell them about my leadership style. Let me tell them about how I would tackle a situation in terms of where they disagree. I know it's funny. I know there's a lot of memes and TikTok videos and stuff that jokes about how hiring managers and recruiters should have to answer the difficult questions. And I agree with you, they should. I'm just saying, if you want to maximize the number of job offers you get, you will wait till you have an offer to do some of that stuff. If you get interviews extremely easy and you have more opportunities than you can possibly handle, and you want to make some exceptions or change this or whatever, then you're at a different level than everyone else. And, you're the top 1% of all candidates or all interviewees. But if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably not. And I would say, even if you're, at the vice president, CXO level, director level, hiring manager level, there's always someone else that is potentially better than you, that also has the qualifications that you do, that also has the second degree or has gone to a great school or whatever. So for those of you that are earlier in your career or those of you that don't have as much credentials, I don't say that to scare you. I actually say that to assist you and help you spend the vast majority of your interviewing time. I would argue all of your interviewing time on what makes you a great fit for the company, what makes you a great fit for the role, what makes you a great fit for the team. Depending on where you're listening to this, I would love to know your questions. I would love to know your comments. If you're listening to this on YouTube, please drop your comments. I try to answer and respond to every single one of them. If you're listening to this on Spotify, you can comment or ask questions there as well, or track me down. Like, you can find my contact information if you look hard enough, and give me your feedback on this episode. Give me your questions. Give me your concerns. I promise you, I have answers to your concerns. You might not like my answers, but they'll be answers based on facts. Or whenever facts are not available, there'll be facts based on testing. There'll be answers based on speaking with thousands and thousands of hiring managers and recruiters, and sometimes asking them the question or for feedback in a different way so that you can come up with the exceptions to what works and what doesn't. I'm Mike Tomasello. I'm your host. Thank you so much for listening to the Career Success Secret Show. I would love your subscribe. I would love your follow, and let me know what you want to see in future episodes, and we will try to make that happen. Thanks.